Jackie. It's great to be here, and thanks to all of you for joining. We still have folks trickling in the room, so I'm going to slowly get us started, and hopefully everybody will be able to join once we get into the substance. But I'm Marty Flax. I'm the director of the Human Rights Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I'm delighted to be with you all today to talk about a potentially really important topic, which is the next iteration of the U.S. National Action Plan on Responsible Business Conduct. Hopefully many of you heard Deputy PDAS Scott Busby speaking this morning about the administration's, at least DRL's, view of the NAP and the process that they intend to undertake. And what we wanted to get out of today's session is really a discussion and a bit of brainstorming and maybe a bit of strategy conversation around what we as civil society might want to get out of the NAP and the NAP process. And so the hope is that this session can tackle three questions. One is sort of, can we come to a common understanding of where the current NAP, the 2016 NAP stands, what was done, what wasn't done, and kind of where that process lies. Two is just this question of, is this process, this new process, worth our engagement? What are the opportunities there? What are the challenges? What are the drawbacks to engaging? And if we do individually or collectively want to engage in the NAP process, what are some of the priority issue areas or topics where we see opportunity to really have impact and to really leverage the NAP process to move forward administration or US government policy on issues that we care about? And then three is just, if we get to this point beyond brainstorming, of starting to talk about strategy, whether that's individual action from all of our collective organizations, or if there's an interest or a utility in any kind of collective action. So with that, I think the structure of today's session, it was only 55 minutes. It's relatively short. I do want to make it as open and conversational as possible. We're a relatively small group, so please do feel free to jump in, use the raise hand function so we can have a conversation. But what we're going to do is start with a presentation from Nicole from ICAR. As many of you know, ICAR was heavily involved in the last NAP process. And so she's going to give us an overview of how ICAR and the ICAR community engaged with the NAP process last time around, what came from that, and then a bit of an assessment of where some of those administration commitments stand today. So after she does her initial presentation, we're then going to open it up to a conversation, a little bit of discussion on those three topics that I mentioned. And I will put those topics in the chat box in just a minute. But I'm going to turn it for now over to Nicole to get us started.
Great, thanks, Marty. Yeah, happy to be here and be in this discussion. I was glad to hear from PDAS Busby this morning that they will be doing a baseline assessment this time around, and that there will actually be some form of consultation, open dialogue, and it won't just be an internal government sort of review and update process. So that's at least somewhat good news. So as Marty said, I'm going to talk just very briefly to give an overview about sort of how ICAR engages the first time around, what sort of some of our key, and I'm sure none of this will be news to any of you, but our sort of key critiques of the content of the US NAP, and then sort of just a rough initial assessment of implementation so far. So yeah, during the development of the Obama administration's NAP, ICAR and quite a number of our US partners were heavily involved in the consultation process and advocated for strong commitments to be included in the NAP, and for sort of a good, strong process to be used to develop it. And for sort of ICAR's part, we worked with partners to develop a fairly comprehensive shadow national baseline assessment for both Pillars 1 and Pillars 3. And then we used that to sort of identify key gaps in UNGP implementation in the US so that we could then develop, we ended up developing, I think, close to 200 recommendations for commitments that the US government could and should have included in the NAP. Of course, we didn't expect all 200 to make it in, but there was in terms of the percentage of those sort of stronger commitments that went in, it was quite low. And those sort of recommendations covered a broad range of business and human rights and corporate accountability issues, everything from trade agreements and reforming the USNCP to government procurement and land rights issues. In addition to sort of the thematic recommendations, we also included recommendations targeted at specific agencies. So tried to make it as concrete and clear as possible. So just to highlight a few of the examples, we of course included a recommendation to require businesses to conduct human rights due diligence. We suggested implementing international frameworks and initiatives like the voluntary principles on security and human rights and others into law, and to require companies to disclose their policies and practices related to those frameworks. We recommended in the realm of procurement, we had quite a few since we were heavily involved in advocating for procurement reform at the time. We recommended using the standard of contractor responsibility to evaluate contractors' human rights records and exclude a contractor for the government if they lack necessary operational controls and safety programs, essentially due diligence, to address the risks of human rights impacts in government supply chains. And of course, refusing to agree to include ISDS agreements in bilateral investment agreements and other trade and investment agreements. And on sort of more of the third pillar side of things, recommending that DOJ and other agencies investigate why federal prosecutions in the area of corporate crimes related to human rights remain rare. So of course, I don't think any of those things made it into the final NAP. And in terms of, when we looked at the content that came out in, was it January 2016 or, yeah, I think that's when it was, not December, right? Yeah. But the NAP was very largely focused on supporting voluntary measures and dialogue. There was really not much, if anything, on commitments to regulatory or mandatory measures or anything that would, create real obligations on companies. The scope of the NAP was completely extraterritorial. It didn't address, domestic business-related human rights issues at all. As we heard from Pete Busby this morning, this next iteration will be the same. They're not going to be addressing domestic issues in the new NAP. There's also very little attention paid to Pillar 3 in the NAP. And then finally, just as a way of maybe transitioning to the evaluation of implementation, many of the government action points were quite vague, and that poses a real challenge and difficulty to holding government actors accountable to actually fulfilling the commitments if we can't actually tell if they've been implemented or not. So things like, continue to have dialogue with businesses on X is a little bit hard to measure without concrete and clear frameworks for monitoring and evaluation of implementation. But we did, I asked our wonderful fellow Jackie, who's here with us, to take a crack at sort of going through the new and ongoing commitments laid out in the NAP, and she put together a really great chart laying out sort of things that she could tell definitely were implemented, things that are unclear, and things that have definitely not been implemented. And I'm happy to share that document with anyone in the room if you're interested. Yeah, so it was a fairly good resource, and I think out of that, it definitely became clear that there's actually quite a few that have been implemented. So for example, one of the commitments was for the Department of State and USAID to launch a global anti-corruption consortium. And that was done in 2016. And then also there were a couple of things related to, so the, let's see, amending the FAR Council's regulations to provide a definition for recruitment fees, which was completed. But then there were also quite a few where it's a bit unclear. So, for example, there was on the procurement front, there was a commitment to coordinate a dialogue among selected state and local government officials and the federal government on ways to better protect human rights in public procurement, which actually in my mind is one of the better of the many dialogue-focused commitments, because a number of state and local governments have fairly robust and at least stronger than the federal government requirements and sort of ways of integrating human rights, at least in their apparel procurement. So that was sort of one area. Was like, well, maybe there will be some learning and benefit out of this, but it's not. There's no public information on whether that was completed or not. So yeah, again, like I said, I'm happy to share sort of the full evaluation out to folks here in the room, so you can take a look at that, and we might translate it into something public facing and share that out as well. But hopefully the government will also produce something that lays out what they have and haven't done so far, so we have a good sort of baseline to start from. Okay, with that, I'll hand it back to you, Marty.
Thanks, Nicole. That's great. That's really helpful. So some of the things I took away from that are pretty low ambition last time around, especially compared to the many, many recommendations you all provided. Maybe some implementation, maybe more than we would have expected given the administration transition, but probably clearly not across the board. And then a inadequate level of transparency around what's actually been done and what hasn't been done. So it's actually hard to know how far they've gotten in implementation. So that's super helpful. Let me just pause and just ask if anybody has questions for Nicole about that assessment before we turn to more of a discussion. Bennett, did you want to ask a question?
A quick question and then a comment once we get further into the discussion. A question for Nicole. In terms of the baseline, and I'm sorry I joined 7 or 8 minutes late here. You may have addressed this already, Nicole, but it would seem to me that a useful element of the baseline is to take a look, sort of do a comparative analysis of the different national action plans by a number of other governments that have been put together over the last half dozen years. And I think we all, to the extent that we've reviewed or studied them, that some are stronger than others, but it would seem, without being able to cite off the top of my head any examples, chapter and verse, that there are probably some very strong commitments and elements in some of these national action plans from other countries that could be models for a further US one to emulate or adapt to varying extents, and also ones that could be developed in partnership with other countries, particularly home country governments of other multinationals in the same industries, where US multinationals have a heavy concentration in areas, countries that have significant human rights risks and issues. So I hope that can be part of the baseline as a sort of global comparative analysis to try to tease out some of the better commitments by other governments.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a great point. And separate from the national baseline assessment, we had for, I think, up until maybe 4 years ago, every time a new NAP came out, we would do a full evaluation using sort of the criteria that my former colleague, Sarah Blackwell, had developed with, I think, DHR and a number of other partners. And then sort of had a packaged, I think there's at least maybe 10 of them in the full analysis report version, where it sort of does do a little bit of an evaluation overall, and sort of pulls out some of the key strengths of some of the NAPs, with the idea being that those evaluations could be used to help inform other governments' NAPs moving forward. But yeah, that's a great point on sort of using the good examples from other countries and other NAPs to sort of drive the US to do better. And I can drop in the chat in just a minute sort of links to all the various documents, just so that folks can take a look at those if they'd like.
That would be great. Thanks, Nicole. Let me see. I think Stephanie, you had a question for Nicole as well.
Yeah, it's more of a comment. Thank you all for this presentation. Just one of our reflections from the last NAP was that and this kind of gets into the implementation question too, is that we saw some commitments that weren't new, for lack of a better term. So they were just kind of collecting what the US government was already doing. An example was that they put the review of then OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation's environmental and social policy statement, as a commitment, but that was already a process that had been in process for well over a year and a half at that point. And so, and I think that gets into implementation too, because if you're already, and I understand that probably like a NAP is also about documenting and getting an understanding of what's going on, and that's great. But I would just want to make sure going forward that we're not just collecting the same old things that are already happening, and that there are new kind of constructive and bold commitments.
So that's a great point and a great transition to our discussion around kind of what our expectations should be for this NAP process. And I should say off the bat as well as I anticipate all of you having lots of great comments and questions, and I reserve the right to call on people if not. So just be aware, we're a small group, and I really encourage active participation, and I am happy to know many of you. So be on alert. And I'm going to start with someone who knows this process very well because he was involved in this process 5 years ago. That's Eric Beal, who was in the USG during the last NAP process. And Eric, I wonder if you can kick us off with a sense of your view of that process from the inside, and maybe partially in response to the comment that we just got that, sometimes what these things do is package up commitments that are already in train, and there's reasons for that maybe you can speak to. But what's your sense of, where the roadblocks were in the USG to more ambitious commitments last time around? And do you see different opportunities this time?
No, thanks, Marty. It's great to join you. And I did have the chance to listen. And Nicole, thanks for the remarks. And I did have the chance to listen to Pete S., Scott Busby, an old friend, this morning. And so a couple of things I'm going to say relate to what he said to the broader group this morning. So yeah, I want to look very briefly both back and forward, because I think above all, I don't want people to be discouraged that things have been locked in on the scope of this. I mean, I don't have any insights. I'm not in the government anymore, but I want to reflect on a couple of things that pivot off of Scott's comments this morning without sounding like a critic of our good friends at DRL. I mean, on your points, Marty, I was the, for those who don't know me, I was the Associate Deputy Undersecretary at ILAB DOL from end of 2011 through the last day of the Obama administration, so about 5 years, and was coordinating ILAB's work and allegedly the broader work of DOL during the previous NAP. But I'll come back to that second point in a minute, because that goes to kind of the domestic international wall that I think we still need to all push back and try to break down. So, what happened then, and again, no need to recount it in detail, was a process that seemingly was open with various open fora and a lot of great NGO participation, CSO participation coordinated by ICAR and Nicole, and Matt Grogansack was very involved, and others, including some in this meeting. And then kind of things came to a bit of a standstill. And, I won't go into how the sausage is made within the administration, but there were some delays and there were some questions. And I think one learning experience from that is who's in charge. And again, none of this is meant to say anything about the great people at DRL, but it's not good enough to say that DRL is in charge. I want to be blunt about that. You need a person, and I raised this question earlier, at the White House in a senior position at the end, and Marty knows this from her experience at the NSC, at the NSC or NEC or wherever they may be, who has a commitment to this process based on their work on human rights, democracy, whatever. And we had a couple of names mentioned by Scott earlier, and those sound promising to me. That office was not, or the structure of it in the previous administration was not deeply involved in the last NAP, which was driven by other parts of the NSC, slowly, deliberately, and with a narrow focus. So right off the bat, I would urge everyone, starting with the ICAR, to make contacts beyond our friends at DRL that include at the White House, NSC, and include the Labor Department, frankly, which is a friend on this, Thea Lee and the team there, whoever ends up being put in charge, as I was the last time around. So that's one thing. Just, you're right, it was a compendium of activities already undertaken. It wasn't a visionary document. That doesn't have to be the case. It can be broader on prescriptive elements, on ideas for regulation. That'll be a debate in some areas. And on the really artificial divide between global, international, and domestic, it's time to break that down. I mean, we have an administration that talks about a worker-centric approach to trade and other issues, and is breaking down domestic and international quite nicely there. So why not here? I just can't accept, to be honest, the idea that it's too big to include, or including domestic would make it too big and too complicated. Now, maybe that's true for some areas of the government, but I will tell you, in the case of the Labor Department, there's no reason that some of the activities of other parts of the Labor Department beyond ILAB, including OSHA, wage and hour and so forth, should not be part of something on responsible business conduct. I just don't think that that's the right starting point. So, think about that and who it makes sense to talk about, because it was somewhat frustrating. The other thing, and I'll stop in a minute, Marty, I don't want to dominate the conversation by any means, is, the funny thing last time around, or maybe not so funny in retrospect, is the one consolation we had seeing how things were moving slowly, consolation up to the beginning of November 2016 was that, well, if we don't get it all in the current NAP, the Hillary Clinton administration that will certainly follow will pick up and run with that. So now it's 4-5 years later, and hopefully the Joe Biden administration can run with that and take things much further. So a couple of quick suggestions just to wrap up, following on what you said, Nicole, and building on what I've already said. The first is just don't give up on this idea that it's baked in already that it won't cover domestic. Of course, if DRL is in charge, their mission is global, international, and there's no reason to think they would focus on things beyond that, which is the reason you have to have the White House, NEC, NSC, and labor and others engaged from the start. The second thing is, in terms of who to engage, I've already referenced that. And this doesn't take away from having DRL manage the process with the website and so forth to some extent, but it just has to be broader. And the last thing I'll say is there were some in the last in the Obama administration, I should say, who were not friendly to the process as far as those of us at ILAB and probably DRL were concerned, although, I won't name names and ranks and serial numbers, but there are places in this administration, I'm confident that will change, and that starts with USTR, or maybe it doesn't start with USTR, but it includes USTR. I would reach out early to the team there around Ambassador Tai, including Nora Todd, the Chief of Staff who used to work with Sherrod Brown, and others, and they have an overflowing plate. So I don't know, whether the labor office there would be put in charge, but there's no reason USTR should not be on the right side of this one, given what else they stand for. So those are a few thoughts. And again, I think the point of this all is to feel encouraged that there is a process that can be quite different, and not to feel like things are already setting in that will narrow the scope and narrow the ambitiousness of the exercise, although it won't be easy. So let me stop there. I'm sure there are others who can react and build on some of those points. And back to you, Marty and Nicole.
Thanks so much, Eric. That's great. And I will just add a plus on the USTR point. I think the shift in USTR's work in positions on a whole range of issues interesting to us from the Obama administration to now has been really interesting, and we're very early on. So it's great to see them as a potential ally this time around. Just in surveying our former USG crowd on this call, I wanted to turn back to Bennett just to see, you weren't directly involved in the last process from inside, but given your experience in influencing government from the inside and the outside, what would you suggest in terms of implementing some of the strategies that Eric was just talking about? How do we get this to be a priority for the right people who can put the right level of leadership into this and the right level of ambition into this?
Well, thanks, Marty. I couldn't agree more with really all of Eric's comments. And I say this, especially with respect to DRL, where I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary in 99, 2000, the last 2 years of the Clinton administration under Secretary Albright, that DRL's leadership is absolutely necessary and just as strongly not sufficient on its own. That leadership has to come from the White House to coordinate interagency. And I think, Eric experienced firsthand, I heard close up secondhand of some of the tensions at the interagency level, and there just was not a strong driver from the White House, and that needs to happen. And DRL in the State Department really do need to play a leading role, but this has to be a strongly led from the center. On the domestic international divide, Not only was that a huge deficiency in the 2016 effort, as we all recognized and complained about at the time, but I'll go even further and say that given the rhetoric, the language from this administration, from President Biden, as recently as in his magnificent speech at the Dodd Center at University of Connecticut just late last week, it would be hypocritical for the administration not to meld domestic elements into this NAP. Nobody has been more forceful and eloquent than President Biden himself in making the point that our leadership that we must rekindle abroad on behalf of democracy and human rights has to rest on rebuilding our democracy and protection of civil rights and human rights here at home. So I hope that there's an understanding at the highest level of the administration from a political as well as a policy perspective that we've got to do better. Just a couple of other comments. I want to come back later in the discussion with a very specific angle that will resonate with several of you with whom I've worked on the issue around human rights defenders in civic space, but come to that later. I just want to say quickly right now that yes, the national action plans are meant to build Pillar 1, the state responsibility to protect human rights consistent with the UN guiding principles. The guiding principles have to remain the framework and the touchstone. But I think that for the 10 years on now, and reflecting on John Ruggi's untimely and sad passing just several weeks ago that was so shocking to so many of us, that will be the durable framework for the foreseeable future. But the guiding principles themselves shouldn't be limiting. They're the floor, not the ceiling. And while I don't think we should have illusions about the prospects for a treaty, even the third revised, more practical, more pragmatic one out on the table a couple months ago, I do think that this new iteration of the NAP has to recognize that the state duty to protect has failed for most states, that it has to be reinforced or created in the first place where it doesn't exist. And also, at the risk of getting theological here, and I'll end on this point, I don't think it's good enough that companies just respect human rights. Operationally, I don't think it's a meaningful distinction between respect and protect. I know that gets into all kinds of international legal minefields, but when I think about just what the US government itself has done in the business and human rights field, going back to incubating what became the Fair Labor Association, conceiving and creating really the voluntary principles on security and human rights, and we can all mention dozens of other examples. We expect companies not just to respect, but to protect human rights, including in some life and death situations. So I think that the guiding principles need to be the frame, but we need to interpret and apply them in a dynamic, not a static context. So I'll end with that and come back later on defenders and civic space.
Thanks, Bennett. That's helpful. And I'll just say on the domestic versus international divide, it's especially ironic given the emphasis at the Democracy Summit on that self-reflection, internal commitments that we expect the US government to be making, or at least referencing in the context of that summit, to not then apply that same thinking to this. And so I hope that as we're thinking about this process, we're thinking about how to leverage the summit and the commitments that come out of that, if indeed there are, to kind of push the NAP process a little bit further. And maybe that'll be a little bit easier to do that once those Democracy Summit commitments start to get rolling. But I want to open it up to other folks. I know there's a number of folks on this call, Stephanie and John, and probably, I just lost the other person I was going to call him, but to who were engaged in the last process from the outside, from the civil society side. And I wanted to get a sense from some of you all of what strategies you felt like were effective, if any, and if you see those same opportunities existing right now or greater opportunities. You know, we're looking for that sweet spot where we can move this process along and be ambitious, but you know, but we don't, given the number of priorities that we all have and the number of priorities the administration has, we want to make sure that this effort is worth our time and that we're going to get sort of the bang for the buck that we're looking for. So just any reflections from folks who were involved in the last process on the civil society side about what you felt was effective would be welcome. I think we lost, I was going to call in Kirk, but he disappeared. So I'm going to have to call in somebody if you guys don't, someone doesn't jump in. John, since you've got your video on, I'm going to put you on the spot because I know you always have thoughtful things to say.
Even after you do so, I'm going to give a long pause as third white male speaker in a row here.
I know. I'm sorry about that.
I am too. But I'm delighted also to hear, you know, wisdom from Eric and Bennett, you know, from whom I've learned a lot, you know, on how to navigate, right, this space. Okay, so I'll go in. I'm also very excited to hear from others, you know, on this call, and maybe see you too. I think, you know, the first thing to say is, you know, and some of this won't, you know, be altogether new from what we've heard from others here, but it's you know, we're at a different moment, right? And we know that it was at the tail end of the Obama administration when NAP 1.0 came through, and there is real opportunity to see it. And, you know, it's committed, you know, with Secretary Blinken committing, you know, really in the first 6 months of the administration to NAP 2.0. So that's significant in itself as an opportunity to shape how this administration could see it through. You know, and that also, obviously, that coincided that announcement with then the UNGP's 10th birthday and anniversary, and that was important just to signal. You know, proud that, you know, there was a crescendo in different ways in different capitals at that time, leading up to the G7 as well. And even for OSF, I will say, like, that was the same day we got a memo, more on the internal front, but I will share just that corporate accountability, you know, would advance in OSF as a topic as we, you know, restructure and re-strategize, which meant a lot, and I took nothing for granted there. But it's a credit to ICAR and many other players in the space that's happening, and we're leaning in. You got a lot of that from Tom Perriello in his keynote this morning. So, you know, we then had a lot of that to build on coming from June and those kind of announcements, you know, to the world and internally in OSF land. I think just then reflecting on what opportunity we have for going forward with NAP 2.0, because we're in a different moment, and because I think, you know, there's such civil society and social movement pressure that's been building over these 10 years of the UNGPs to see it as precisely what Bennett said, a floor and not a ceiling, that then we really have to look for the ways to inject this new, you know, NAP update process for the US as, you know, one of high ambition, one where, you know, John Ruggie himself was, you know, giving us good vocabulary and or amplifying it on the smart mix, on, you know, the due diligence vocabulary now is so resonant and has a lot of, you know, we know there's a lot of potential from the French law that's already on the books to the European Union proposal to just now see what echoes from Europe, you know, may inform the U.S. NAP and U.S. new policy and legislation coming, you know, thinking of the NAP as maybe the comprehensive blueprint, and also the you know, in some ways, the repository for not only what exists on the books for the U.S., but for, you know, for what can be put forward, what can be new. And so, you know, this is really for the ICAR community and for many other stakeholders to really drive the debate to action on what form, you know, due diligence takes in U.S. policy. I think there's so much opportunity with the executive branch. We don't just have to talk about a very divided Congress and what we could get through it. I think the last thing I'll say is just on the Democracy Summit and the interplay there with the NAP, which also came up as a question for Scott earlier. And I don't know if we got the full sense of it. We got some, but, you know, there's one very potential concrete opportunity I see where investors who have been active in the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, but also other investors that PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, kind of also bring in even more trillions of dollars in assets under management. I could see a potential commitment from new and existing investors of the human rights nexus, including on civic freedoms and human rights defenders. And I would just be excited for any feedback from anyone here. Having picked Bennett's brain a bit, I'd love others as well on what potential there might be where investors have been pressed and are now pressing companies really quite impactfully, I think, on human rights, and whether that can be something new that we see from both the summit and maybe ways that the USG amplifies, and embeds in a NAP.
Thanks, Sean. That's a great question. And I hate to call on people whose videos are not on because I never know what you're doing in your lives in the background, but I will. So just be forewarned. And I just want to pick up on the last comment, John, you just made, because I had a question about both investors and the private sector engagement in the NAP. I didn't have the sense last time around that there was a lot of sort of pushback or even really engagement one way or the other from the private sector, from companies in the NAP process. Maybe that's because it wasn't threatening enough to them. Maybe it's because they didn't see an opportunity in it. But I wanted to pick the brains of the folks who do engage a lot with the private sector. So Bettina or Rebecca, or maybe Joanne, on what you're hearing, if anything, from companies on this process. And if those who engage with investors want to respond specifically to John's question about, is this an opportunity to really leverage their interest in both the summit piece and the NAP process. Rebecca, you turned on your video, so I'm happy to turn to you.
Gotta be careful about hitting that video button. No, I'm just kidding. I'm glad to be here. And thanks everyone for the contributions so far. And John, thanks for bringing up the Investor Alliance, because this is actually an area of work in particular related to mandated due diligence, getting legislation passed in the EU, and then hopefully here too is a real priority for us. And just, I think a couple things, both John and Bennett had said something to me similar in a private conversation, this idea of kind of how to bring some of the momentum that's happening in the European Union, across the pond here to the United States. Maybe learning from some of the lessons around the numerous national level campaigns that were going on simultaneously with efforts to develop EU level legislation. I think there's a lot that can be learned there that we can draw on, in particular, how to bring in the private sector, investors and companies to be a force of support. I mean, if you take the German efforts to pass mandated due diligence legislation, which resulted in what they're calling their supply chain law, there was a real backlash in the end from the corporate sector. And I think there, the takeaway was we needed to be more effective earlier on and letting those voices weigh in and be heard, because the corporate sector, just as investors, are no monoliths, right? So, and I think that's something that, while certainly I know a number of civil society organizations cannot, just because of their missions, work closely with businesses and investors. Some do, and I think we need to look where we can bring those business and investor voices in effectively. I was just to maybe do a little self-advertising if I can here for the Investor Alliance. We just actually week before last released our investor statement in support of some specific provisions around mandated human rights and environmental due diligence in the EU, and I was really pleased because we actually got 94 investors to sign, and so there obviously is interest there, and those investors, they're also seeing it as really an important piece of legislation in terms of enabling them to conduct dialogues with companies to help better, disclose and understand where there might be risks to people and planet in the investments that they're making and then those companies' activities. So I'll leave it at that, but I think that's really important that we strategize on how to bring those investors and company voices in.
That's great. Thanks, Rebecca. And I will just add, I think that there's an interest on the Democracy Summit side as well. I think that my editorial comment here, the administration is really struggling to figure out the role of the private sector in that summit, and they're really, really behind in developing anything concrete. And I've heard from a lot of companies that they're waiting to be sort of told what to do. But I think a strong statement from, for example, the investor community outlining, their expectations would be really helpful in kind of pushing the discussion forward and making clear that there is an important role and actually defining what that is, because it's getting a little bit, frankly, shoved by the wayside at the moment. So that's something of interest. Happy to talk more about that. But I think those are that's a great example of the influence that you guys can have collectively. Did anybody else want to come in on that, kind of the private sector interest or the investor interest piece?
Yeah, super quickly on the investor piece. And I'm mindful that I've already spoken twice and I want to come back later on defenders, but just on the investor piece, look, this one can make the argument that the single most tangible, useful commitment and output of 2.0 would be EU-style mandatory human rights due diligence. The U.S. was the pace setter with Dodd-Frank 1502 on conflict minerals, California Supply Chain Transparency Act, which, the latter translating into the U.K. Modern Slavery Act, the former into comparable EU criteria, but we still don't have here comprehensive human rights due diligence on a mandatory basis. And that is where we get the investor push. Some companies will resist, but they're going to have to go along for the most part anyway when this EU directive is fully formed and implemented by 2024 or so. So I think that that's, I think, the biggest opportunity to pull in the investor side is on the mandatory due diligence side here as a big bang output, centered focal point, really, second to none, I think, of what we should be pushing for. And we could start to lay the groundwork for that pretty quickly. Investors want and need that data. Not all of them realize it yet, but a growing number do.
Thanks, Bennett. Joanne, did you want to jump in on that or related?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and apologies, I'm actually in writing mode, so didn't get Friday, Thursday casual is sort of where I am. But I couldn't agree more. And I wanted to say, some of you know that at Rights Collab, we've been working with SASB to improve SASB with respect to human rights. And this suggestion actually, and since SASB was created to fill this void in US securities law that sort of punted to the responsible investor, and since we're a very weird animal compared to Europe, we've been thinking about ways to sort of, but SASB is also under tremendous pressure now to globalize its standards. So we've been thinking about ways to make that bridge. And in our conversation with Janine Gillette, who is the executive director of SASB, she had actually suggested that we put together a MSI of sorts that's kind of modeled on the Church of England's MSI that they did around tailings dams, which SASB is now working to sort of build as a basis for adoption. So on that basis, we have been talking to a number of international pension funds. This has actually been spurred on by Amundi, the French asset manager. We've talked to Investor Alliance and others, and we're now in the process of trying to build that human rights due diligence multi-stakeholder initiative among investors to try to identify what we'll call due diligent or decision useful human rights due diligence. So it's essentially taking human rights due diligence and translating it into what the IFRS, SASB, and others would then be able to kind of identify with and adopt. And so maybe sort of thinking and hoping that that could be the investor bridge that brings the United States back into the fold on that.
That's great. Thanks, Joanne. That's really helpful. So a number of you have started to mention some topics, and I wanted to maybe pull the thread a little bit more on some of the themes that we want to see pulled out of this NAP. I mean, Bennett identified a really important one around mandatory human rights due diligence, and obviously ICAR and others have been pushing on this and have, draft legislation. And so, but that's one specific area of work. And I think the investor piece is also broader than that. But lots of, as Joanne was just saying, but some great opportunities there. Ben, I know you want to talk about human rights defenders as a topic. I wanted to throw one more out, one that's pretty much, I think, absent, although Jackie or Nicole will correct me, but there wasn't a big emphasis 5 years ago on tech and human rights. And it's hard to believe that was 5 years ago that things were that different, but 5 years ago things were that different on tech. And as somebody was just saying, I think Tom Perriello was just saying this morning, you know, the Obama folks all left and went to big tech because it was still seen as the folks who were going to save humanity, and the times have changed. And so, you know, what do we need to be pushing for in that regard, and that was absent from the NAP? Those are 3 topics that that seem obvious. So happy to get any reactions to those. And also, are there other big topics, big issues that we think this is a really big opportunity to make headway on? And feel free to jump in, like use your raise hand or wave at us or turn on. And you don't have to turn on your video to speak. If you'd rather leave it off, that's perfectly fine. But Kendall, did you want to come in?
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much. And sorry, I've got a kid with a norovirus. So I've been moving her from like buckets and beds to new buckets and beds all day.
I'm sorry.
I feel like many of us have been there. So it seems like a safe space to talk about it.
Thank you for being with us despite that.
I really wanted to piggyback on both the decision to discuss human rights defenders and human rights due diligence, because I think that legit human rights due diligence identifies risks to human rights defenders well before it becomes violent or imprisonment. And I don't think we have done nearly good enough work demonstrating to companies and financial institutions that human rights due diligence helps. And a big problem in this is that they're all keeping it secret, and so they can scope it and they can scale it and they can time it in such a way that it loses its value, and consultants have a really hard time pushing back on that, lest they lose all their business. And so I think the NAP is a major opportunity to require some transparency and set some standards on what human rights due diligence needs to look like, so that we can push back against these arguments that are happening in Europe right now on the mandatory human rights due diligence legislation, that due diligence doesn't help. That's all. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Kendall. Stephanie.
Yeah, thanks. It was mentioned before, but the third pillar on accountability and remedy, I think, is really important, and ensuring that there is actual like meaningful remediation of harms caused by industry and other actors. Specifically, also looking at U.S. government actions and mechanisms for addressing harm. So there's a U.S. national contact point, but several of us have been following it and want to push for it to be stronger and to use its leverage more with businesses. But then there's also ensuring accountability for other international activities, for example, like the Export-Import Bank, what remedies are available for those who may be impacted by XM's financing. And so that will be one of our key kind of areas of focus. I know that Kirk from Earthrights is also interested in this issue of remediation.
Yeah, great flags. Thank you for that. Jim and then Eric.
Thanks, Marty. Yeah, just on the point on human rights due diligence as well. This is Jim Wellington from Human Rights Watch. I'd be interested to get people's thoughts if we do kind of break out on that issue a bit more, as to kind of how to engage with it strategically in the US, given perhaps less political appetite for it. So for example, should our objective be simply assuming that it's going to happen in the EU, but not happen here, perhaps for the next 5 years? And if so, what does that mean in terms of how the US administration and the US government should engage with EU legislation? But then also secondarily, if we don't think that it's feasible to have sector-wide or comprehensive human rights due diligence, do we need to be looking at specific materials or minerals or sectors where there is maybe room for more progress and integrating that into an action plan? One of those things being climate minerals and minerals that we need for a green transition, where maybe there is more space for a more niche and more tailored piece of legislation, albeit obviously less ideal.
Yeah, great question. Eric.
So we're covering some broad ideas, and I don't have anything more to add to the good comments on mandatory human rights due diligence. And I think that should absolutely be at the epicenter. And I look forward to what Bennett and others have to say on defenders. I want to put another challenging but important area on the table, which is I was thinking about this in particular because just this morning, Verite issued a very interesting new report on the rights of refugees in global supply chains, focusing on forced labor and child labor. And I can't help but think, and this also ties into the domestic international and the need to break down that divide, that there should be some room to discuss issues relating to migrant workers in this country, including in agriculture. I mean, this was the third rail for the Labor Department in the first Obama administration before I was there, when a modest effort to impose, or I shouldn't say impose, but to utilize stronger regulatory measures to deal with some of these issues was nixed under strong agribusiness pressure. And again, you can't cover everything in the NAP, and I'm sympathetic to points raised by DRL and others about scope, but I think it would be logical and sensible. And whether this is an ICAR priority or working with other NGOs, CSOs with great expertise in this area, but I think there's a fundamental need to talk about the rights and duties applicable to migrant workers, both as an international issue, and again, the Verite report, I think, is highly recommended, but also as a domestic issue. And frankly, it demonstrates why that wall has to be broken down. So just wanted to flag that.
Thanks, Eric. Absolutely. Let me turn to Ernesto.
Thank you. It's been a great conversation. Really excited to be part of this and part of this effort this time around. The one piece that I wanted to add to the discussion here is about federal procurement policy and leveraging the power, the purchasing power of the U.S. government. You know, last time around, there was the executive order and implementing regulations on forced labor, on human trafficking and federal contracts, which survived the Trump administration kind of somewhat miraculously from my perspective, but is vastly, in my view, underutilized by the advocacy community to leverage sort of the power of those rules that currently exist. Right now, and I think this also bridges the domestic international divide, because there is a really active conversation about what the government could be doing to incentivize good business conduct through that power of the purse. There's legislation, the Patriotic Corporations Act, that would do a range of things in terms of labor, gender, and other areas. And I think that this is something that could have real sort of far-reaching impact, and also sort of impact the private sector in kind of an oblique way. So just wanted to add that to the mix, to the discussion for implementation. Really excited to be part of this group.
Yeah, great point, Ernesto. And I'm fascinated by your background, and I want you to tell us what it is.
It is from a New Yorker cover. This is a cartoon of a Brooklyn co-op that I didn't do this intentionally. I usually am intentional about my backgrounds. This one was a mistake.
Love it. No, it's great. It's fascinating. All right, over to you, John, for one more topic we ought to be adding to the discussion. John, I think you're muted though. John,
still muted, sadly.
John, can you hear us?
I do. I had a freeze there. Forgive me.
Okay, there we go.
Great to be with and hearing from Ernesto, Stephanie, Rebecca, and others here. We have a lot to do as a community here. I just popped in the chat an article that if it's Politico, it's going to be very tactical, but this is at least giving us the Europe state of play, which is to say, you know, the targeted focus on forced labor in relation to you know, a Uyghur import ban, a ban on, you know, on forced labor imports related to Uyghur, you know, forced labor and genocide. These are, this is in a sense the tip of the spear, and it's a very serious issue, of course, unto itself. And, you know, even from a couple of years ago, I think it was starting to come clear that this may end up, you know, having a weird, maybe awkward, but maybe catalytic way of linking up with the broader push on mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. And I just want to, you know, I'm trying to draw insights from European colleagues at OSF, but it's also from our partners in the field and from how we do this in the US. Basically this question, and it's not a new issue here, but if you take the China challenge and this question of Uyghur forced labor as a specific human rights violation, egregious, and you also take separate, but also a bipartisan consensus around challenging big tech, right, to this angle. I think the China challenge and the big tech challenge become just useful for us to gauge what can be resonant politically, just because there's bipartisan consensus on those two arenas, for better or worse in some cases, and not on almost everything else that we'd want to see. And that's just that's the room to get things done on the Hill politically, but it's also in the room for the administration to be bold with the NAP, or else risk, just very explosive politics and around it. So it's not a new issue. It's just kind of thinking with our political strategist hats on how we navigate, and when is it good to connect these dots, and when is it best to keep them on parallel tracks.
Yeah, I completely agree, John. And I'll add another angle to the tip of that spear, which is, and this is not in any way taking away from that comprehensive mandatory human rights due diligence approach that we all want to see, but the momentum around managing imports and managing exports from the United States, there's real traction around, obviously on the forced labor specific issues for imports around the Tariff Act. I think Scott Busby mentioned the Commerce Department is now looking at exports on human rights grounds for the very first time, which is really interesting. And so those are kind of easy choke points for the USG to kind of wrap their heads around. Procurement would be a third one, Ernesto. I think you're right about that. That could be other ways of thinking about the tip of the spear that maybe you could stretch beyond forced labor, although the emphasis for the moment is on forced labor in those contexts. Those systems could apply much more broadly than forced labor. And so it's something that we at CSIS are doing a little bit of research around, but I think could be an opportunity to, again, to enter into dive into a process where there's already some momentum. So appreciate that perspective. We're just about at time. So I'm just going to wrap up by mentioning that Nicole noted in the comments that ICAR has set up a little email list of folks who are interested in engaging with the NAP process. Obviously, every organization is going to approach this with their own lens and their own strategy in terms of their approaches, but this is a place, obviously, where coordinated action can be really effective and really important. And so ICAR is a natural place to coordinate a lot of that. So if you are interested in continuing this conversation, please do send Nicole an email, and I'm sure she'll be organizing some follow-up conversations. But I think this generated a lot of interesting ideas. It gives me, frankly, a little more hope about the NAP process than I came in with. I've been a little bit down on it, but you guys have really inspired me to think a little bit harder about how to take advantage of it. And hopefully the same goes for all of you. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here, for your thoughtful comments and interventions. I look forward to staying in touch and working with all of you. And thanks, ICAR, for organizing us to be here today.